Valerie, thank you so much for yet again bringing us in so beautifully, and especially on this day when we're going to take on a subject that harp music is such a great accompaniment to. So thank you. Is there anything you want to share about what you played today?
So I actually play healing harp and have found what you were hearing are some very old Gaelic pieces and some old tunes, 1,000+ years from Galicia. And these are songs that have often helped people transmute pain that they're struggling with in grief. So, and I was just contemplating peace while I was playing this. So may peace spread from us on wings of music.
Thank you so much. Well, welcome everyone to our local Peace Economy Gathering. So happy to see all your faces. So please, feel free to post your name and where you're from in the chat so we know from all the places we are arriving. And then I just want to, ground us in this moment as we do when we come together, that we model being here on Zoom as we would in the communities that we create locally. And just start with, finding your feet on the ground, feeling into your breath, and encouraging you just to be with your breath as I share a poem that I feel helps us be with what today is about, by one of my very, very favorite people on the planet, Caitlin Johnstone. And if you don't follow her, I wake up every morning and read what she's written because it comes from her soul, it comes from her heart, and it speaks to the moment. And which is what I strive to be able to do. So let yourself be shattered by Gaza. In the suburbs, they live with animals in their homes, who they treat like people and love like children, while ignoring real children in Gaza. They'll take a baby dog away from its mother and hack its ancient canine conditioning to mistake a Western nuclear family for its wolf pack, in order to fill the void in their hearts, which yearns for unconditional love, all while hoarding their own love so far deep in their chest crevices that they cannot feel anything for a Palestinian burn victim in a bombed out hospital who is screaming because there is no painkiller. We have so far isolated ourselves from nature that we need to fill our homes with potted plants and docile domesticated animals just to feel whole. We drink our wine and chuckle at memes and talk to our dogs like we talk to babies, while the world turns to fire and feral dogs feast on corpses in Gaza. These last 14 months have shattered me beyond the power of recollection. But sometimes it's good to be shattered. Sometimes it's good to be dashed to the floor and cracked wide open so that life can get a word in. Sometimes the heart must be broken to smash through the calluses and cataracts which accumulate on the surface and return us to our original tenderness. This world will break your heart and then pour plant medicine into cracks. It will show you a dead Palestinian child and then show you a white kite in the sky. It will drop you to your knees screaming in anguish, cursing a God you don't even believe in, bawling your eyes out only to open them and stare in wonder at a dandelion growing through the cracks in the concrete. It will annihilate everything you believed about humanity in a blasting Holocaust, and then leave you blinking and bewildered in a mysterious universe of unfathomable beauty. The rusted chains of preconception incinerate from your eyes. Again and again, we are shattered to dust and scattered to the wind by the cruelty of this world, slowly learning that if we can fully surrender to the shattering, it will return us to the primordial clarity we abandoned long ago when we set out to create this mess in the first place. Let yourself be shattered by heartbreak, by loss, and by Gaza. Let your whole universe be reduced to ashes. Let it all die away, and then stand up and rejoin the fight, eyes no longer clouded by anything that could be destroyed by truth. So that's Caitlin Johnstone. You can follow her on any social media. So when we began talking about the war economy and the peace economy and, what the war economy does, it's extraction, it's, oppression and violence, and that we needed to pivot ourselves off of the war economy into serving and cultivating a peace economy for a future of peace, which is what we want. One of the very first things that came up was grief. The grief of what the war economy does, the grief of what we've done with our lives, and the grief of witnessing the world we live in. So it is why we created our cycle of reconnection as a huge piece of this process. And, grief constantly is denied us in this culture, even though in many other cultures, it's core. Life and death are related. Grief and love are the same. It's like they're not separate, but we separate them. So I'm super excited to have Aerin Dunford with us, who is a lead weaver at the Emergence Network, where she cultivates the ground for experiments and practice around the notion of postactivism. She asks poignant questions about the way that humans respond to crisis. She has a degree in organizational management with a focus on leadership and change from the SIT Graduate Institute, and she lives in Oaxaca, Mexico, which I'm very jealous about because one of my favorite places on the planet. And so, it's a huge topic, and we have a beautiful human here to share us. It's like, how can we be in relationship with grief as a path, a tool, and as something to be really in relationship with our whole lives. Thank you, Aerin.
Thank you so much, Jody. Thanks for having me, Marie. Thanks for the invitation. Lovely to see you all this evening, or perhaps you're in other parts of the world. Yeah, and I haven't really prepared very much for this conversation. I just wanted to leave it open and see what emerged with each of you in this community. Jody, if you have questions you want to bring in, happy to be always in conversation with you. And I know we'll have a chance for some small group conversations in just a little bit too, so you'll get a chance to share with one another and then come back for some harvest.
Well, can we start
I was
with
on a, yeah,
yeah. I mean, just if
go
we
for
could,
it.
there is so much to be grieving right now. And I
Yeah.
find people in sadness and grief, at Local Peace Economy, we try to move through it in our cycle of from grief to care to celebration to joy and back around again. How do you bring grief? Let's start with you personally. Bring the process of grieving into your daily life, into how you facilitate for others. Where do you see it lacking? You fortunately do not live in a culture devoid of the tools for being human, like most people in North America. But how do where do you see it missing, and where do you see ways to bring it in to have it be a natural part of life?
Yeah, thank you. It is such a vast topic, and today I was a participant in a call for a grief sanctuary in New Mexico. And I was there with the founder of the Emergence Network, Bio Komolafe, and he and I have been talking a lot about grief, and this has been a really alive topic for the Emergence Network, but also in other spaces. And he said something um, grief is always an experiment. And I think what I'm learning is there isn't really a definition for this. We can't put it into a box. And all of us experience this phenomenon in some way or another, in different ways. And so I think the first thing is, let's let our cycles and models and frameworks about grief maybe compost a little bit, break down, because there can be celebration in grief. There can be so much space for care in grief as well. So I think one of the pieces that I've learned a lot about is how yeah, there's no formula for this. And so learning to kind of stay in the feeling. And another idea that I've been exploring a lot recently is like grief isn't emotion necessarily. It's something that can take you. It's this experience, and it's like that poem, it just can sweep you off your feet. And of course, that can be incredibly painful, and it's really often disorienting, but it can also be this opening. And to me personally, it's been an opening toward feeling, which was really hard for me. I grew up in the United States. I feel like my whole life was sort of shaped by white modernity, Western culture, and even, here in Mexico, so much of the world is influenced by this sort of Western modernity development framework, which um, part of the reason that these times are so difficult is because we were never given the tools or trained in our societies around death and endings, and how to let grief take us, and that's a natural and okay thing to have happen. And I think this is so related to um, capitalism, in a way too, this sort of like endless growth paradigm where we never want to talk about things coming to an end. So it's woven, this death phobia, this grief phobia is like so woven into our dominant systems and framework. Um, and in this grief sanctuary call that I was on today with the board, it's interesting because they were talking about we are living in times of war culture right now. And it is palpable, and it feels like what's being called for in my life, and this is something else that came up, was kind of the mundane grief practices. So of course it's beautiful to go to a retreat or do some kind of a ritual, but what are the things that we can do in our day-to-day lives that let us connect with and open ourselves to being taken by grief? And it can be scary, but as Valerie was saying, it's the music, the dancing, the singing, the poetry, the just spending time together and sharing our feelings with one another feels like an act of rebellion in a way, in these times of ours, because we have to practice, we've got to develop the muscle of being able to welcome grief as this link between life and death and what we love and what we know we'll lose. Um,
Well,
I'll
I'm
just go ahead.
excited that you bring up the joy and celebration part, because just in talking about how it is so unacculturated in the US, um, because it is joy and celebration everywhere else. Think of a wake, think of New Orleans,
Hmm.
and I had one of my most amazing times of grieving in Oaxaca on Day of the Dead, for the loss of my daughter. Just it's so powerful and theatrical, and just like the trickster
Mm.
in everyone that performs on that night, of the that whole trickster spirit. But Valerie, did you want to say something before Aerin goes back?
So I have Gaelic ancestors and also Vikings and Germanic peoples in the family tree. And all of them had massive rituals for death and grieving. And, a lot of that has only been lost in recent centuries. So all of us can go back to our own ancestors of any culture and find an ancestral pathway that we could bring forward for today again. With the harp, long ago, there were 3 types of music for the high music, right? There was, I think of it as laughing music, crying music, and sleeping music. So laments, right, were the crying music. And some say that the sleeping music was more of an enchantment, but there was that was like one of the 3 of the tripod of these emotions that the harp had to play to. And on the one hand, you acknowledge the grief when you compose a lament, but on the other, there's something about it that moves you through it so you don't get just stuck in despair. And it's almost as if those 2 things are happening together.
Thank you for that. Yes, thank you for it, which goes to the trickster in Oaxaca. It's to bring us to the witness that death and life are one, that grief and love are the same. So yes, sorry to interrupt, go on.
No, I love it. I'm glad we're having a conversation. It makes me feel like in the flow. And thanks, Jody, for bringing up your daughter. And I guess I also want to share a little bit of how I started doing this work through my own deep journey with grief. And also this gift that was given to me through my experiences. So I live in Oaxaca with my husband, who's from Mexico City, and we were trying to have a baby for 5 years. In 2016, the doctor said, nope, you can just forget that. That's not happening. Physiologically impossible. And that of course like brought its own opportunity for grieving, which is actually something that I didn't do. It took me a year to grieve that. And in ceremony, not expecting it, not intending to work with it, it finally sort of like broke loose, and I just wailed and cried. And I remember this real lamentation of like, why? And the anger that came there too. And then I got pregnant like 2 months later. And it was, of course, like just incredible, and no one could explain it. And it was this miracle and amazing, perfect pregnancy. And at 40 weeks, our son Raphael died in utero, which is its own, like, stillbirth is such a strange sort of otherworldly experience, because I literally had the experience of carrying death for several days in my body. And then made the choice once we found out that Rafa had left us and had no heartbeat. It was really important for me to give birth to him and go through that experience, because this is the part that's important about grief. It's not about getting to the other side of it, in my experience. It's really walking the path, like being in it and being willing to let it take you to a place where you don't know where you're going. Um, and so, of course, the labor was incredibly painful and very, very intense, and its own journey. And my parents were here, and I had a doula who came from Argentina. And so for a week, after the birth, we were just in this space, like walking our own paths together. And for me, that was an incredible opportunity to see how we all process grief differently, and we all have different rhythms of grieving. And sometimes when you're in a situation like that, the paths converge and it feels like you're walking together, and sometimes they diverge. And I feel like it was really important that we gave each other the space that we needed to go through our own processes. Um, and 3 days after Rafa's birth, I was just in a taxi in the middle of Oaxaca, and we're driving down the street. I was with my doula, and something it was that experience of being taken, almost being possessed by this idea that Rafa came as a calling to do this work. And so it felt very strange. I didn't want to accept that, mostly because it felt like a strange time to be getting messages about my vocation in this world. But something got planted in me in that moment that allowed me then to carry this. It's precious, you know, it's this beautiful gift that I have that can see that in the face of the worlds that we are living in, all of the terror that's happening, all of the unknown that we're facing, there's not very much that I'm sure about at this point. But one of the things that I know is that we're going to need to practice having better relationships with grief and with death and with endings. And so I've been exploring different ways of holding space for grief and grief tending and working with death doulas, writing. Yeah, and I feel really, really blessed that my work has also created the space for this. And recently we just held a big festival called Becoming Monster around these themes. And it was just magical and so beautiful to have the opportunity to be in community around this, and to show up messy and untethered and broken, and because it's also this sense of that we have to keep it all together, you know, that it's really important that we have a veneer of expertise or wisdom about these things, and that we can't show up in the state that we often are in, which is confused and disheveled and sad and heartbroken, because those are the places where we actually can connect with each other. It's in that raw, yeah, undoneness that lets us really connect. So that's my story, and it's been a real journey, and it comes and goes. But more and more these days, I'm feeling like people want this, they need it in order to be able to go on.
So a few things you've said, you know, first of all, to be able to get into the messy. And I think a lot of, you know, first of all, after the election or every day when we look at Gaza, it's like the witness isn't the space where we need to surrender into what happens when I take it in. So there is a way you keep a distance and then that creates a whole bunch of different behaviors that aren't useful to anyone, including yourself and your community, but they're protective, you know, and sometimes you have to appreciate them. I mean, I've looked at grieving, having had to grieve a lot, and realized that a lot of the rituals that we have are wisdom of a community around who we are in that moment that grew into a tool to get through it. So, you know, the busyness, you know, of getting a funeral together and having to do all the things and is so necessary for the psyche to be doing when it's fucking freaking out, you know? So if the psyche can have something to do that reminds it is human and it is functional, while it isn't functional on so many other levels, and you know, that's useful. So it's like putting together the funeral and all that has to happen when you know that you're and two things that happen always to my psyche when I'm like in extreme grief is like I open up to know things I never knew. And it's just in a couple of days and then it goes away. But there's just like the reminder of like how much of ourselves we don't use, because when it is like fully like just exposed, like, you know, Caitlin says in the poem, there's a wisdom there, there's a knowing there that you get glimpses of to pull back in, which, you know, goes to like, what is your work? Here, you know, it's always, you know, I'm like, Zakir Hussein died this week. And I was thinking, what did he leave me with? And it was like that he was this master genius musician of our time. But to him, his only task was that when you have a gift, it is to be, you know, is to be shared. And that he did a school to educate others. You know, it's just like, that's a human process that I,
Mm,
so just to speak to what you said, and then, how do we give each other the courage
mhm,
to feel? And so many parents that have lost children come to me for, help. And it's like, I feel like my task is just to give them the courage to go all the dark places, that they will come out. It's like you come out the other side, not the same. You will lose something on the way there, which isn't a bad thing. It's like the essence of ourselves stay, and even we get to know parts of ourselves that have been hidden. But
mhm,
being able to encourage people on the path. When my husband died, Gloria Steinem said to me, who was with me like the night, and she said her husband had died, like, I guess 5 years earlier. She said, give yourself 3 years. That permission was so profound. And it's like you said, to be in the discomfort, to allow it.
mhm.
Losing the great love of my life of 38 years took 3 years of being messy and uncomfortable and all the things that had to happen, including life. But to, just give oneself space, and the way that, the spontaneous weeping can happen.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that, sometimes, when the soul of our souls died in Gaza this week, I literally, it's one of those moments where I was like crying and crying, and I was like, will I ever stop? I didn't ever feel I needed to stop myself, and we do stop.
Mhm.
That's the thing. It's like it finds its natural completion, and it's almost, like uh it's almost like a blessing, a birthing, a cleansing, all the things that
Yeah.
by ourselves, and we don't go into, as you say, the mystery. So just
Mhm.
name some of the things that I heard you say, so that we can take it. And I feel like there was also somebody asked a question
A
in the
question about anger. Let me just say, and I can bring in a little my experience with anger and grief too. What you just mentioned, these two different things, for me, I've talked about them as like the pendulums before, where it's like the doing and the staying busy, which I agree, like it is important in those moments to keep the psyche occupied. And I think there's a real risk, especially at least for me, but in our modern capitalistic society that values so much the productivity and the doing. And I have to be very careful that I'm not staying in that space of compulsive doing as a way of preventing myself or not letting myself feel. So that's one end of the pendulum, just doing and doing and doing. And we see that in activism and in movement space all the time. And then on the other side is what I call like the pit of despair. And of course, the fear, if we stop doing, is that we go into the pit of despair. But we have to let ourselves, let those spontaneous tears come. It is a cleansing, and we won't stay there forever. So we trust that we'll kind of swing back and forth. Both of those things are very important in my experience of the process.
Well, I just want to bring up, it's why we cultivate a local peace economy, because we can't actually do these things alone. And it is for real that you can get stuck in those places without having a community of care. So thank you for bringing that
Absolutely.
up.
Yeah. And
Because
how do
then
we
you
do this
can allow
together?
yourself to do it. Because
Exactly.
in a community of care, the care of that community will pull you out. It's like, because then how do you trust yourself in community? How do you trust your community? It's how trust is built, of when somebody comes and says, it's time to, it's like, where are you? It's, yes, despair can take us down into the those are all real things. And if we know that, that's the part about like why cultivating a community, why grieving in community, why having a community of care that is also part of your grief and your care and your joy and your celebration is so essential. And why
Hmm.
this building of community is, you know really essential, even to grief, which feels so personal. But it is also communal, because it has gifts, because you're in a space that the rest of us aren't in, that can see things in a very, very different way. Um,
Hmm.
because it is a wake-up call to life and love, and the it's like when I'm grieving, it reminds me how deeply to love, because it's like, even it's like the opposite of that was how deeply I loved, and I wouldn't give up that deep love for anything, even this moment of extreme pain.
Yeah.
So that it takes you away from the fear of loving deeply,
Mm.
of giving,
Mm.
and of living fully.
Yeah, it just reminds me, my kind of second grief teacher after Rafa was Francis Weller, and he, in his ceremony and ritual, you have the altar and you go and you lament and mourn there, but the village is there to receive you when you come back. And that's why we need to cultivate all kinds of community, so that we have loving arms to come back into. And it just feels so important that we're not navigating these spaces alone these days. Somebody put something in the chat exactly about this as we were talking about it. It feels just more important than ever to be there for one another and to open spaces for sharing, yeah, our hearts with one another. And that includes the question about anger, Susan. I mean, for me personally, anger was something that just came, like I just had this one moment. I was in a gathering where I was supposed to have been taking my 4-month-old son, and of course I went alone. And we were doing some, process around common ground, and I just lost it. I just remember, and it was unseemly. Like I was cursing God, and I don't even know if I believe in God, but on the ground. And I think it's hard to fake anger, but when we create the space for it to be safe to show our anger, it can come up. And I have no regrets about that, even though it was in front of a group of people. Maybe it was even more powerful in that sense. And I think that we don't know. Again, it goes back to this mystery, the experimentation. How do we just stay present with our feeling bodies, with our feeling senses, so that we can share that instead of the story about what grief is supposed to look like? We don't know. It's a mystery.
So anything, wisdom, you have around the combination of grief and anger, since it's one of the stages of grief? How have you navigated that process when grief,
Hmm.
you're in that like fall into nothingness and be angry at everything, because that's like the next, uh that's
Yeah.
your moment of like, why me, why does the world behave this way, the constant,
Yeah.
the shouldn't part.
Right. Well, I mean, I do believe that the why me is where it's when we begin to take things personally that we get into trouble a little bit. And of course, it's personal. And I've had, support therapists and other guides and mentors that have helped me kind of like get out of that very self-centered victim. And I'm still there. It's been 6 years, and I'm still kind of sometimes like I get resentful, and I see mothers and children, and I get angry or upset about that. And it's just, I think that the process is, let that be there. That's okay. It doesn't help to push those feelings down or feel shameful about them. Let them exist inside of you. But don't stay there, it will change. So let it flow. And then I think just like stepping back into a space of, this isn't personal, right? So other teachers that I've worked with, Stephen Jenkinson, really helped me with this. In his book Diawides, he talks about how in the Western modern framework, we wake up every day with a sense of being entitled to the life that we have, especially in the United States and in the West, and in other cultures and other times and other ways. People woke up every day astounded and grateful for each breath. And what a difference in the outlook on life between feeling entitled to something and feeling just incredibly awed and grateful for what we've been given. So that's another piece. And this stuff does happen. I think that's the other thing. It's like, he said something about someone once talking about children in cancer wards of hospitals and saying something like, oh, this shouldn't be. but it is, you know, and so how do we not get out of our moralistic idea of like children shouldn't die or babies shouldn't die, or, you know, it is happening. And so there's a sense that we just have to accept that in a generative way, not in a passive, resigned kind of way as well.
Well, they shouldn't be murdered. I just want to say.
They should not be murdered, but they are being. I mean, that's the other thing.
Okay.
That is the fact too, you know, and it's
I know.
tragic and terrible.
But we can still hold that that is a shouldn't. Um, so I'm loving all the questions that are coming up. So it feels like a good time to go into our little 3-person pods. So, you know, this wasn't to answer all the questions. This was to bring up the conversation so you would have a relationship, like let it arise with you to be thinking about it. You know, we have tons of tools for you at the website. We have a whole space on grief with people you can listen to, things you can read. We understand that grieving is a huge piece, first of all, of being alive, but also of healthy community. And I see, you know, it's interesting that they were both men who commented in the chat about the unsupportive community. And it's what we're here to do. It's why we come together. It's like we are cultivating communities of peace, communities that lead to peace. We haven't, when things are failing or not working, it's because we haven't been given the tools and we don't practice the ways of having it, you know, occur in the ways are most useful for care and community because of the war economy. So we are serving a process from a very violent war economy that is destroying the planet and people and our communities and everything else. And so just a reminder to be patient, to keep alive all the questions, and that we're on a path of discovery. So it was really today, let's go into the mystery of grief. Probably something we have a relationship in some small way, and sometimes enormous ways, every day. So we want to go into communities. Marie is going to help us. And thank you, Marie, for bringing Aerin here today. And ask the question, you know, what is something that's present in your life today that brings you to grief, that, you know, something where grief is in your heart? And then maybe if there's more to share, and if you want to, you know, add on to that, where do you see grief and love present in the same thing you're sharing? So Marie, anything else we need to say before you take them into breakouts?
No, I'm trying to.
So I wonder quickly, while Aerin's here, is there anything anyone wants to share or bring to Aerin, or we have more people to come back. At least we talked about, you know, how to, you know, anger, anger and grief. Yes. If you look on the grief and cycle of reconnection, I think you'll find some tools there. But as I was saying to Nan, you know, about despair, it's, you know, where's the recomposting of where we are, you know, the witness to, the listening to, the asking it, what does it need to say to us? And then the, you know, the, like, letting it pivot into something, you know, humanized, life-giving, instead of life demoralizing, or life-taking, as the witness in this moment is so hard. And yes, I think everyone would shake yes. And we're here to figure out, and how do we pivot into creating a future of love? Because that we can see the necessity for sure. And it starts with our communities, which I know you all are doing. So Aerin, do you have anything you want to say before we close?
I think Joe maybe wanted to say something. I'd love to hear just maybe a couple little voices from your breakout rooms.
I want to say that one of the things, conditioning has sometimes keeps us from recognizing that there's an intelligence to feeling. And the felt sense you've got to find a way to honor the felt sense, which means you go into silence and you listen and you think, oh God, this is boring. But no, just wait. Because before you know it, and the other thing that needs to be noted is that some of this process can be very uncomfortable because feelings, they're not necessarily negative feelings, but they're weird, they're eerie, they're unusual. But they have a clue. They're a clue to a different way of seeing. And we have to be able to give ourselves, ears. We have to be able to listen. Because I remember that there was a time when I would just be impatient with that kind of thing. Well, I'm not any longer. I should never have been. I'm an artist, for God's sakes. But the conditioning is very strong. Anyway, for whatever that's worth, we really need to pay attention to the felt sense, how we feel, give it some juice,
Thank you, Joe, and the need to sometimes express ourselves in art, creativity.
Oh, yeah. That's for sure.
I know. I just want to bring that up since that's you. We have some new people with us today, which I'm sorry I didn't get to hear from. So if there's anyone new that wants to share, we welcome you. And just remind everybody that I am going to be here next week at the start of the new year, where we talk about commitments and new beginnings and where to plan an offering. So I cherish this community and the coming together and just being able to share life together every other week. So is there anyone that hasn't spoken that wants to share anything from their group? Carol.
Yeah, I want to share that we talked a bit about the grief that we're feeling overall as part of a movement in the middle of a bubble of everything else going on, and like during the holidays especially. And I shared as well about like grief of losing somebody from the encampments, and grief of seeing the crackdowns and like a lot of this type of thing happening. And I want to honor just the wisdom of like the generations that have gone before us and that have led the way in this, and just how important that voice is. Because for us who are new to this and like younger, trying to navigate a very hyper surveilled world, it's a lot. And it's very, very helpful to hear the voices of people who have gone before us, and just being physically there is in itself immense. And we need your voice. We need the wisdom that you share, the experience, the tactics that you've used before, and also the processing, the grief, the love, all of it. We appreciate it so much. There's so much we need to learn. And yeah, thank you for being there.
Thanks, Carol. And just a reminder that there's tons of tools for, grieving and, cultivating the communities that we need to in this moment on the local Peace Economy website, peaceeconomy.org. And always that you can reach out to Marie at peaceeconomy.org for questions, concerns, guidance. So we're at our hour. Deepest gratitude for all you do. Marie will send a follow-up email tomorrow with some of the links that have been shared in the chat, and the link to sign up for January 1st next gathering, and our writing workshop, and the poem that I read tonight from Caitlin Johnstone. Again, if she will help you rail, feel, be angry, and be joyful, and celebrate and scream. So if you're not following her already, I find her as she's very short every day, some into the tuning fork of feeling and life. and being human. So thank you all. Thank you, Marie, for holding us. Thank you, Aerin, for bringing your wise, generous, and heart-filled voice to this big topic. And Valerie, thank you for bringing this in with your very healing harp music. Gratitude to all, and may your holidays be nourishing, and you find space to care for you and your community. Thank you.
Mm.
Adios.